Okay, going to be talking about pass-through financing. I'll give a brief overview of what you see on the slide, and then I'll read the prepared notes. Um, so pass-through financing is when a large housing network takes out a bunch of mortgages on a bunch of properties all over the place. The customer joins the network, signs an occupancy agreement, pays a monthly amount. The network takes that monthly amount, pays it to the lender for the underlying mortgage tied to that property that they're in for the occupancy agreement. Once they record the transaction and we see the reduction in principal, we issue shares of the network gets the ownership stake, but then the customer gets universal shares of the network. So basically, as the network earns equity, it issues shares of the network to the customer to where take the money from the customer, give it to the lender. The network is the owns the properties, and then it passes on shares to the customer. So that's the whole concept of pass-through financing. It's an indirect method of financing. All right, so I'll read the notes, much of the same. Pass-through financing is where a company creates a large housing network with units in multiple locations that customers can navigate over time. The network takes out mortgages for every unit in the network where the company is the actual mortgage customer. Customer joins the network and pays a monthly amount to the network based on the unit they occupy. Then the network pays the lender the monthly mortgage payment for that unit in a true pass-through manner. Once the transaction goes through, the network issues the customer universal zero equity shares of the housing network. The network owns the property and holds them long term like a trust, but the customer owns shares of the network in a symbiotic relationship. The customer is free to move around to any unit in the network they can afford and still earn shares. Ideal goal being for each customer to build up enough shares to sell later on as a down payment to purchase their own home, sell shares to buy a home outright, or they can continue to stay in the network forever. Navigating a patchwork of properties and building equity over time is what I call pathing, as in building up individual equity accounts in a stepstone manner to build a path to home ownership. There's no rent as they're building equity from day one, and there's no ownership of the property for the customer, but as they occupy a unit, they accrue shares over time into a transferable equity account. Pass-through financing leverages the humble mortgage to create a flexible financing housing network that benefits all. The model of implementation I'm thinking of would be a zero equity housing cooperative that's heavily modified to where there are no share loans for a unit, just monthly shares of equity that are stored in an account. A fancy name I've been using is a fractional co-ownership of a financial pass-through universal zero equity shares housing network, or as I simply call it, pathing. It's not rent to own, instead it's occupy and accrue. Alright, most renters want to be homeowners, but in order to do so they need a mortgage. However, most renters are very unstable, and it's due to all of these variables. Because they move around, they have, depending on how long they stay, the price involved, who they're roommates with, but they all want to eventually build equity. Alright, so most renters want to be homeowners and would likely need financing. If every renter were given an opportunity to take out a mortgage right now, it wouldn't be the fix it sounds like. The fact is, mortgages are ideally for stable customers. A mortgage can be altered but has its limitations. Modifications can be made, of course, but they have defined parameters of how far it can be adjusted. Mortgages are not designed for excessive instability. Mortgages work best when customers are stable and long term. Most renters are not good mortgage candidates when they're first starting out on their own in terms of finances, relationships, employment, and are generally more risky on paper. Over time, most renters do turn into ideal mortgage customers. However, mortgages suck at dealing with the curveballs life can throw at people. Locking most renters into a long-term debt agreement will not work. I suggest we design a system that addresses all the variables that make most renters a poor fit for a mortgage and turn those uncertainties into manageable factors. A housing system needs to be made that accounts for all the unstable variables that a person can generate, where a customer can start, stop, resume an account on short notice, move to multiple locations over time, stay in that location for any amount of time, whether it's a few months or decades, find a unit that fits their budget and able to change units when their income fluctuates, able to have any number of roommates, and all while building equity. When you convert a mortgage payment into shares, this allows every customer to freely move around a network while building universal zero equity shares of the network. Turning renters into homeowners doesn't begin with affordability, but addressing unstable short-term variables with flexible financing. Financing is a superpower that most rental customers can't benefit from. I say we change that. Quit trying to lock people into mortgages. Instead, use mortgages to build a dynamic, fluid system where everyone can build a version of equity. All right, brief overview of the slide. So, most standard housing cooperatives involve a person taking out a share loan, which only gives them occupancy to one unit at a time. What I'm proposing is that they join Occupy Accrue cooperative housing system to where you have an account to where you can move to any unit over time. But then when you join a network, you'll have multiple sites to where you could not only move to anywhere within that certain city, but also to different states and across the country to where you build a large comprehensive network where you have an account that you can truly be flexible with. So the model for how I'd like to build a housing network is based off of a zero equity housing cooperative. Most folks who take out share loans for housing cooperatives are already good mortgage applicants. Most renters don't really get to benefit from what housing cooperatives have to offer because they're still expected to be qualified mortgage customers in the sense that they have to qualify for a share loan. And I'd say most just aren't there yet in their lives. When a company takes out mortgages on the behalf of customers that join the network, that changes things dramatically. Once monthly mortgage payments can be converted into monthly allocated shares issued to network participants and built up into transferable equity accounts, any customer that can make a monthly payment starts to benefit indirectly from long-term financing that mortgages offer. By merely occupying units and making routine monthly payments, customers can start to accrue shares in their accounts, which builds long-term value. They can sell their shares at any time on the network exchange. A true pay-to-play housing system that accounts for all the variables that mortgages on their own struggle to address. This is the concept in a nutshell, but there's a ton of details that support this premise. Okay, so universal zero equity shares, what that basically means is for some cooperatives, they have them called as limited equity, which means you could buy the share loan and then you could buy the actual share of the property and sell it for a small return, a small appreciation. And then they have market value equity shares where you can sell it at whatever the market value is. What I want to benefit and utilize is zero equity shares where basically whatever you bought it for is what you sell it for. So it's basically you earn shares for all the fixed costs, which would be the down payment, closing costs, principal, interest, PMI. $1 you pay in fixed cost equals 1 share. Shares are sold at par value of $1, so no appreciation. Save money and build accounts over time. The network operates under the assumption that everyone joining the network will need financing. So, the heart of pass-through financing is taking a standard fixed-rate 30-year mortgage and converting the monthly payment into universal zero equity shares. Universal meaning it doesn't matter which property you go to. Any share is can be represented across the network as a whole. It's not tied to one specific property. Every monthly payment a customer makes will earn shares based on how many fixed costs were paid that month for the unit they occupy. All fixed costs incurred by the network that actually went into purchasing and financing the property will be turned into shares that are available to be issued to the customers over time that they occupy that unit. So closing costs, down payment, principal, interest, and even PMI that the network paid will be converted into shares at some point. Variable costs like insurance, taxes, maintenance, management fees, etc. are not issued shares. Each share will be issued at a par value of $1. The shares can appreciate and can only be purchased by current or future approved customers. The network will pay each underlying mortgage for every unit off exactly as the amortization schedule stipulates. Occupy and Accrue networks operate under the assumption that everyone will require financing, so issuing shares for interest seems odd but is essential. The fact that the value of this share is zero, meaning it can't appreciate and there can be no ownership of the unit, sounds bad, but this limiting of the price and holding the asset long term means that prices will be kept low in perpetuity. As folks build up their transferable equity accounts and sell their shares as they exit the network to customers that replace them, it keeps prices low. There's no appreciation of value and no true version of ownership, but customers can still build up accounts and benefit from saving up shares for future sale. When folks join the network, they will have to have a minimum threshold to their account for the unit they choose to occupy. The minimum threshold amount is basically a mix between a safety deposit they'd normally pay for a lease contract and a down payment they'd have to pay for a mortgage. However, the network will try to keep the cost of down payments as low as possible. So yes, there is a large upfront buy into the network, but picture the closing cost of a unit and a 5 to 10% down payment for an economy unit being the minimum threshold amount needed to occupy a unit. The network assumes multiple roommates will help split the upfront costs amongst themselves, so one person doesn't have to come up with a ton of money to join the network. There's a case study at the end of the field guide that breaks the cost out pretty clearly. Not enough time to do a deep dive into all of this for this presentation, though. All right, so this example is taken from the case study 4 in the pathing field guide. So the top bar is what the customer pays. All they know is that they paid $1,206 and they get 729 shares. What the network sees is, all right, they give us that money, but we break it out into every expense bucket needed, and we pay the mortgage off according to the amortization schedule as intended. So this is based off of a micro apartment. The customer pays a monthly amount of $1,206 and got issued 729 zero equity shares. The customer only knows that the monthly payment is $1,206, but when they get their payment, we take out the property management fee, put funds into a maintenance account, pay the taxes and insurance, pay the mortgage insurance, and then pay the lender the principal and interest portion. Once the transaction has gone through, we issue the 729 equity shares to the customer. On the surface, the customer only knows they pay X and they get Y shares in return. Below the surface, the network is diligently allocating every single dollar precisely where it needs to go. The customer doesn't need to know the exact breakdown of how many shares are assigned to principal or interest. The customer doesn't need to know every expense account their payment is being deposited into. I've heard rental customers exclaim over the years that they don't like having to deal with maintenance or of their unit and the landscaping and all of those aspects that go along with home ownership. That's true. Most renters don't have to directly deal with property maintenance or cut their own grass, but rest assured their monthly payment has that expense baked into the monthly payment. The Occupy Accrue cooperative networks are no different. Yes, they pay a monthly amount, but that is broken out into numerous buckets that need to be paid to keep the networks humming. There will constantly be two versions of the network, what the customer pays and earns in shares, and what the network pays and how those funds are allocated appropriately. A very simple dual entry bookkeeping type scenario that is the foundation of pass-through financing. Okay, so each unit will have a maximum share threshold that can be reached. The threshold amount is the total fixed cost paid for that particular unit in terms of PMI, closing costs, down payments, interest, and principal. All the expenses that had to be paid before the unit could be owned by the network. Once customers reach the threshold amount of shares for the unit they occupy, they no longer have to pay fixed costs for the unit, but only the variable monthly costs of taxes, insurance, maintenance, etc. The monthly mortgage payment is paid by the customer, but delivered to the lender by the network. As the lender records the principal and interest paid on the mortgage, the network issues shares to the customer for that total fixed cost paid that month. For Unit A, based on a 30-year fixed rate at 7%, the max threshold amount is 712,072 shares. Since the network will pay the mortgage off according to the amortization schedule, we can calculate from day one what the total fixed cost of the unit will be. For Unit A, we put down $20,000 for a down payment, paid $15,000 in closing costs, and paid $64.50 for single premium insurance up front. So the minimum balance needed to enter this unit would be $41,450 because that represents all the upfront costs of the unit. So 41,450 shares would need to be bought before occupying the unit. Then the $280,000 of principal and the $390,622 will pay for the life of the loan would be the long-term fixed cost. As the principal and interest are paid back, those will have shares issued. If the network were to only issue shares based on the principal portion paid every month, no one in their right mind would ever want to be the first person to spend the first few years in a new unit because a standard amortization table is front-end loaded with interest. And I was joking to myself one day about the dilemma, and I was like, well, maybe I should just issue shares for interest. And I kicked it around a little bit. It made no sense. And after a while, it made all the sense. Because any mortgage customer has to pay the principal back, but they also have to pay the interest, so on a fundamental level they are intertwined. A core concept of the network is that every customer who takes part will need financing, so a monthly payment that contains interest payments is expected. Once you convert a mortgage amortization table into an equalized version of itself, it makes chronological time irrelevant. Anyone can occupy the unit at any point of the mortgage and accrue the same number of equity shares. The network operates under the rule that all mortgage payments will occur based on the amortization table, which means you know from day one that the total number of payments will have to be made and how that principal and interest will be paid out to the lender. So then you just total both costs and spread evenly across the 30 years. So it doesn't matter if you're the first person to stay in the unit or the last. The shares issued are equal across time. The network will, of course, keep a keen eye on the amortization table, but the monthly breakdown of principal and interest for the consumer is meaningless at that point. The equalization of the mortgage interest and principal payments sort of make the whole thing work. So basically, what it boils down to is this is the purchase price, but as far as the network is concerned, this is how much we actually wind up paying for it. And since we know we're going to pay this off over time, it doesn't matter where the customer falls at on the amortization table. So really, these colors are broken down into two distinct, but as far as the network's concerned, this is all one color because we have to pay this in order to own the unit. And the customers have to pay this in order to make the whole network function. So breaking it out to principal and interest as far as the customer is concerned is meaningless. For us, so yes, we have to allocate for that and account for it, but at the end of the day, the network is going to pay this to own that unit, and so will the customers. So really, we can equalize it because if you say take the first month, see how it's like first front end loaded with interest. If we were just issue shares off the principal, it would be a tiny amount. But both of these need to be paid, and everyone in the network will need to pay them. So really, there's no point in differentiating and issuing shares based off of either version of this. So just issue a general share based on the actual fixed cost itself. So principal and interest will earn shares in this scenario, which makes all the sense. Okay, so the reason why equalization plays such a large part is obvious, but I'll elaborate a bit more because I think it's neat. The table in blue above is what a traditional mortgage looks like when there's one customer making 360 payments on a 30-year mortgage. The color blue represents one customer over time paying the mortgage off. Each column represents a year. The table below represents a hypothetical unit in an Occupy Accrue cooperative network where many customers can stay for any duration of time. The network doesn't need one person to stay in the same unit over decades. What the network truly needs is to make sure every month a payment for that unit is made by someone. As the network takes the monthly payments from customers, our payment history will resemble the top table as far as the lender is concerned, but really the payments will look like the table below, potentially hundreds of customers paying off the mortgage over time. Mortgages are great at financing an asset, but work even better when they're not tied to a single customer. A network that is in charge of paying a mortgage off for the long term but is able to break out equity shares each month is the solution. Long story short, I've studied every housing option out there. I pulled the things I liked from all of them and tried to incorporate them into a new housing option that I call the pathing industry, also known as Occupy Accrue cooperatives, also known as pass-through financing, also known as transferable equity account networks. It's all the same to me at this point. I use those terms interchangeably, and I apologize for that. I get that the lack of appreciation and denial of ownership might seem like a downer at first glance, but long-term affordability hinges on those two factors being removed from the equation. I give a full analysis in the report. It should be in the table of contents as Frankenstein's monster, but I don't have the slide note space to do a full analysis in this PowerPoint of all the existing options out there in terms of housing models. Alright, so why appreciation of shares isn't a good thing for the housing networks? Everyone wants their dollar to appreciate and grow to $2. I counter that with sometimes costing less is preferable. Maybe saving a buck ain't the worst thing ever. The only people that want housing to remain affordable are renters that want to save and purchase a new home. But the second a renter takes out a mortgage and gets on the path to home ownership, they want their asset to appreciate and double, if not triple, in value over time. I get that. But when the entire world wants prices to go up, that doesn't bode well for affordability long term. There's really no one trying to keep downward pressure on the housing market until now. My housing model makes long-term affordability a priority. Why ownership of the unit in the housing network isn't great. Customers can build up shares over time and then sell to generate funds to have a down payment for a mortgage, but Ownership within the network is counterproductive to long-term affordability. The only way to preserve affordable housing for the long term is to make sure that units aren't constantly being resold at market value. Normal, zero, or limited equity housing cooperatives understood this powerful concept decades ago, but the concept hasn't seemed to gain much traction. There should be at least a third of the housing market that fights to keep housing units affordable for the long term, and the only way to ensure that is to keep them from being resold at market value and held for the long term at original cost so that future generations can benefit from cheap prices. Instead of waiting for policy changes and markets to correct, I say we just build a new housing option that solves a lot of the yucky parts that exist in the real estate market now and come up with a new cool method that can benefit everyone and not just some. What I'm proposing isn't some new fintech or cryptocurrency gimmick. It's literally a concept, which are cooperatives, that are retro in design and a blast from the past. It's just taking the fundamentals of financing with mortgages and combining a bit of property management to build a new housing option that can benefit all renters. So I want to take this moment to apologize for the graphics and overall design of the slides. I'm working with a bare minimal production value, and I'm also not that artistic. And I'm sure there's a more elegant way of depicting a network share exchange where shares are sold within a closed internal system, but you get what's shown in the graph. The black balls represent shares of the network. The network will operate a share exchange where sellers in the network can list shares they wish to sell and buyers in the network can purchase shares. All transactions are anonymous and the shares are only sold at par value of $1 per share, or they can discount below $1 if they grow impatient. Shares can never be sold above $1. Even though the network issues shares based on closing costs, down payment, interest, PMI, and principal paid by the network, once the shares have been allocated and issued to the customers in the network, the shares become universal zero equity shares of the network. So when folks sell, let's say, 100 shares, it doesn't matter the composition of fixed costs that were paid for that unit. All shares are not bound to any expense account or the unit where they originated from. They merely represent the book value of the network that has already been accounted for. So all shares bought and sold on the network represent exactly what it costs to finance all the units. So they all pay the same interest rate in a weird sort of way, which is whatever it actually costs. When customers buy shares on the share exchange, they're lending to each other in real time, and in a way, I think it might be the most fair lending platform that has ever existed. Think about 10 units that have been paid off by the network and a constant pace of customers leaving the network and joining the network. The new entrants will buy the existing shares from the previous occupants, and since the units have already been paid for, the shares are constantly recycled in a way to where the same number of shares for those units will always exist within the network, and as shares are bought, it's a form of peer-to-peer lending. So since the mortgage has already been paid on the underlying unit, the shares represent all the fixed costs that existed at one point. Yes, the mortgage is paid off, but now the new entrants need to build up their threshold account to match the underlying asset. And the only way to achieve this is by buying the shares from the previous customers in the network. So as shares are bought, that represents a second-hand form of lending in a true peer-to-peer lending manner. So I'll go around the slide real quick. So let's rock around the clock. So in this scenario, a customer buys 4,000 shares to reach the minimum balance to enter the network. So let's say whatever unit they're trying to get, a tiny micro unit, has a 4,000 share buy-in, so they need to buy 4,000 shares from the exchange just to join the network. In this one, a customer has some debts they want to pay off, so they sell 7,000 of their shares to the exchange. This one, a customer buys 5,000 shares to reach maximum threshold and pay only the variable cost. So, or let's say they get a tax return or they just have some money sitting in their account and they want to just all of a sudden reach that max threshold to where now they drop down their monthly costs to a lower amount, which I guarantee you a lot of people would want to achieve that. It's the same premise as like paying off your home to where you just lower a monthly payment to where you still have to pay the taxes, the insurance, and all of those variable costs, but I think a lot of people are going to want to reach their max threshold. And so let's say this person's just leaving the network in general and they're moving out to go wherever else. They just straight up sell 4,000 to the exchange. So as this person enters, this person exits. Makes sense. So let's say for this one, they buy 7,000 shares to win a bidding war. So let's say you and I are both going after a unit that we both want. Much like the regular housing market where people put in bids on homes, you could do that for units in the network. And well, in fact, I'll encourage it for the most part, just because unlike the regular market where you're outbidding competitors, in this one you're outbidding your competitors, but really you're just buying more from the exchange, to where the underlying asset doesn't increase in value. You're basically just saving more at that point, which keeps costs on the unit itself. And then also, as far as like who gets units, for the most part there will be bidding systems like this, but if someone's been skipped over and lost a bunch of bidding wars, or they have a true need based outcome, to where, if it's a lower income unit, then we're going to give it to the person who actually needs it, not the person who's just deciding that they want that choice key location. So bidding will be the majority of the time, but special cases will be allowed for when we who decides gets the occupancy of that unit. So this example, this person sells 7,000 shares at $1 and waits to buy shares at a lower value, to where people can game the system. I'd like to prevent it, but it's a closed system share exchange. But let's say there's peaks and valleys, to where during Christmas time people are going to want to sell shares to buy presents, and to or they want to go on vacations or something like that, to where you'll know that whenever there's the high volume of share purchases, where there's more demand for shares within the network that you can pay for $1, then you could sell some of your shares, because if you know at certain points that there's going to be dips where people are going to wanting to be like, if you're a patient person and you know that someone's going to sell their shares for 50 cents on the dollar, there could be some people that game the system like that, to where again, it doesn't increase value or lower the value of the unit, but certain impatient people will lose in the exchange, and patient people will win, which is just how the free market is. I'm sorry, that's just, I can't stop that. I wish I think there probably could be some roadblocks built into the system, but I think people will probably likely try to game the exchange. Which, if you're patient and willing to and other people are willing to sell their shares at a discount, I can't stop that. Whatever creates movement on the exchange is always going to be to everyone's benefit. So this next case, this person buys 3,000 shares to motivate an occupant to move. So similar to down here, to where, let's say there isn't an open unit for a while, and let's say I have a sweet unit that is downtown, and I like it, but I really don't love it. But you really want this. Like, it's like right next door to where you work. You could just come over and be like, hey, you could list. I could list on my account that if you want this unit, you can basically buy 3,000 shares for me to grease the wheels of exchange, to where you basically bribe me to move, which is, I mean, people who own their own homes can list their homes for $1 million, even though it only costs 500,000. And if someone is willing to pay that, and they're motivated enough to pay that $1 million for that $500,000 home, then that's just the way the world works. To where I don't see why there can't be moments in the exchange where there's gridlock properties in an area, and then I see on your account that, hey, if you pay me 1,000 shares, I'll move right now, to where, yes, you benefit 1,000 shares that I buy for you, but I get that sweet unit that's going to cut my commute down from 30 minutes to 5 minutes, in which case I'll take that deal. So the last example is this person sells 5,000 shares to make to make the next few months payments, and which is basically eating into their financial fat for preservation at this point. Which I think, as long as people have their minimum threshold amounts, they can do this, to where if someone loses a job, or if someone for whatever reason they fall into financial difficulty, they can always sell shares to make the monthly payments. Which, once they reach that minimum share threshold, they'll do a financial tripwire, to where we'll be like, okay, well, whoa, you can't sell any more shares because you're already at the minimum threshold. So at that point, once we see them cutting into their financial fat, I would love to have account reps reach out to them like, hey, Why are you selling off into your shares? Are you buying a new car, or did you lose your job? Can we help you get a new job if you are looking for a new car? We have an entire network of people ready to help you for whatever reason you're cutting into your shares. I don't want to see people selling off their shares unless they truly need to. I would love to put roadblocks into preventing this kind of stuff, but it's going to happen. People will have a ton of reasons why these scenarios will take place, but there will always be reasons why people will sell their shares and lots of reasons why people will buy. So I can't say exactly how the share exchange will, like how it'll fluctuate and what the volatility will be, but there will always be movement on here, and as it grows with a larger amount of people, the demand will always be there. So that's just kind of a glimpse into like some of the methods that peer-to-peer lending can work. I've always viewed Occupy Accrue cooperative networks as a version of a stepstone process to homeownership, a path to homeownership, which is why I call it pathing, the pathing industry. Each unit has a maximum share threshold amount before the monthly payment drops to only cover the variable cost for that unit. What I'd love to see people do is join the network in the smallest, cheapest unit possible, build up their transferable equity accounts to the maximum share threshold for that unit. Then, when they reach the maximum, instead of just paying the reduced variable cost amount of the monthly payment, they continue to buy shares from the share exchange once they reach the maximum share threshold so they can build up the larger unit's maximum share threshold. Idea being, it's not guaranteed that a person's income will continuously grow over time. What if their income stays the same for a long period of time? If they can't make enough to pay for a large unit's monthly payment, that's a bummer when it includes fixed and variable costs. But that doesn't mean they can't start in a smaller unit where they can afford the monthly payment, then build up their account to the maximum share threshold for that unit that they're in. Then when their monthly payment lowers to cover the variable cost of that unit, they continue to buy outstanding shares on the share exchange. Yes, they're still only able to pay the same monthly amount, but once they build up their transferable equity account to a larger unit's maximum share threshold, their monthly income really is only limited to the variable cost of that larger unit that they want. So there is a way for folks to work their way up over time, and if their financial situations worsens over time, they can move into units where the monthly payment is reduced. Folks should be able to move up and down the housing spectrum according to their financial situation with ease. Ideally, folks should be able to build up their accounts to the point when they sell all their shares, they should be able to have a substantial down payment for the house they want if they're not able to buy a property outright. Or they can continue to stay in the network the rest of their life because it's a really cool way to live, in my opinion. So yeah, basically work your way up, and if you want to downsize or you run into financial difficulty, you could always move back down to where I really do. It'll probably be bottom heavy for the most part with nano, micro, studio, and 1 bedroom units. Because once you start getting into the 2-3 bedroom units, I would say most people, once they get to the 3 bedroom unit, they're ready to exit the network and buy a single family home, which we would love to have those in the network as well. And then once they reach to this stage, the housing network itself can have its subsidiaries tracking their progress and be like, hey, we getting ready to build a new subdivision and you qualify for one of our loans, to where we could basically treat this as a revenue pipeline for the lending arm as well. So it benefits the network to have this constant progression for our customers. And also we want our customers to just kick ass in life. So I don't see why this isn't the way it's always been. I know it's up to the individual to make this happen for themselves right now, but I would love to build a housing ecosystem where this is the norm. This is the expectation, to where they're constantly making progression financially. I fully realize for most people home ownership is the main goal. I'd say that most folks that currently rent would like to become owners at one point. I think Occupy Accrue cooperative networks can be a great stepstone process that allows folks to build value over time with their transferable equity accounts. As folks build up their equity accounts, they can opt to sell their shares on the exchange and use the funds to put towards purchasing their own home. Once customers build up their accounts to maximum share threshold, their monthly payment drops to only consist of variable costs for the unit they occupy. Once they're paying a lower monthly payment, they can stay in the network while they pay off debts and or save money. Networks can become a good place to recover from financial difficulty or build up their financial health over time. I know most folks would likely want to leave the network and pursue home ownership at some point, but they can also decide to stay in the network forever. There's no reason for them to exit. They can. It's not written. As long as they're making the monthly payments, they'll always have an occupancy agreement. There is no occupancy limit for any of the units. In fact, if they wind up staying in a unit for decades and wish to pass the unit on to their family or friends, as long as the monthly payments are made, I don't see why properties can't be retained generationally. If it's legal to break a mortgage into fractional shares like I intend, I can easily see a future where anyone who has a current mortgage can convert their equity stake into shares and join the network with a transferable equity account. The same goes for anyone that currently owns their home outright. For current homeowners, a clause can be put on those units where after a certain time frame the occupancy availability expires and the original owner can exit the network and go back into their original home. I think these types of networks can become appealing to not only renters but also current mortgage customers and homeowners as well. So basically, in the near future, I think everyone might be able to cycle through the pathing industry at one point in their life, no matter where they're at on the housing spectrum. The solution for affordable housing has already been solved, kind of, sort of. A new twist on an old method is the only thing needed. Housing cooperatives are good, but they're not great. With a few tweaks, there can be a whole new way for customers to build a version of equity that has never been done before. The most realistic outcome to make affordable housing for the masses involves a flexible financing system that converts long-term mortgages into monthly payments that generate a form of equity shares everyone can benefit from. I'm trying to find a way to get all renters building economic value at the same rate as mortgage customers. The current model of Occupy Accrue cooperative networks has never been attempted, but I think it's worth trying. I need help to get started. I think this can help millions save trillions over the next few decades and well into the future. Thank you for your time.